Thank you all. So since we've been back from lunch, and I will give a shout out to our editorial producers here, we've had 4 really powerful panels and conversations in a row. From mayors, a very strong statement from Emmett Carson, a discussion of the last mobile home park in Palo Alto, and then this discussion about where teachers live. And they all revolved around the same question. As Emmett Carson said, he said housing is the core problem facing this part of the world. We know some of the numbers are pretty daunting. From 2000 to 2014, the county created, Santa Clara County created more than 180,000 new jobs and added more than 113,000 new residents, but built only 36,414 new housing units. Rents have increased more than 60% in San Jose in the last 5 years. We have a slide, I think, which gives a just kind of a representation of what it takes to afford a 2-bedroom apartment or a house in this area. So let me start with a big, broad question, since the last panels have certainly identified the existence of a real problem. What's the core of the problem? Is it economics? Is it geography? Not enough land? Is it politics? Is it political will? Why are these trends so unbalanced or out of whack here in this part of the world? So, Kate, let me start with you. What do you see as the core of the challenge?
Well, I think the core of the challenge is actually historical. I mean, the problems that we're currently facing are problems that we seeded back in the 70s and the 80s. In the 70s and the 80s, most of the Bay Area went through a process of becoming kind of more serious about zoning, and a lot of what they did is downzoning. They did a lot of rezoning areas to make sure that they remained single-family home areas, or to make sure that they were very low-density apartment buildings. At that point in time, a lot of cities instituted height limits, density limits, a lot of setback restrictions, and just a lot more restrictions in general with regard to where housing can be built and the kind of housing that can be built.
And they have not, and was that, were those rules and restrictions adopted for, in essence, a very different world than they're living in now, in terms of the economic activity in this area?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of what happened during that time was before people really realized that Silicon Valley was going to be Silicon Valley. A lot of people who came to this area at that time and who were in charge of cities at that time, the people who were voting at that time, were people who were here for reasons completely unrelated to it necessarily being Silicon Valley. They saw this as a nice place, as a nice suburb, and they wanted to keep it that way.
Mm-hmm. Candice?
Before I answer and piggyback on Kate's answer, I want to add some daunting statistics. I think we heard that.
Pull that a little closer, yeah. There you go.
Is it right there?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
There we go.
I want to add some of the daunting numbers. I think we heard earlier that the median price of a for-sale home in Santa Clara County is over $1 million now. The median rent price is about $3,300 a month. Then we look at a city like Palo Alto, the median rent price is $5,500 a month, and the median sale price is $2.5 million. And that's usually a tear down on a 6,000 square foot lot. So I think putting in that perspective, it's a huge
So how do we get
problem.
here?
And so we need the land, we need the funding, we need the zoning. But even if we have all 3 of those things, we still need the community will. So we need projects that are not overturned by a referendum because maybe they're not the prettiest.
Well, we'll come back to that in a second, but how did we get here in your mind? How did we get to this point?
I think it was a combination of many things, the job growth and people coming in and the community saying, hey, I don't want parking, I don't want traffic, just as long, or I support affordable housing, just don't put it near me. So it's almost a drawbridge mentality, and that I'm trying to figure out, how do we become a haves and haves not? How do we close the door when people are here?
Ben, how did we get here?
So I think a couple things, and I think the historic perspective is helpful. There's certainly a piece here, which is we simply haven't been building enough housing as we used to as a state. And I think the data is pretty clear on this statewide. For most of the 70s and 80s, we were producing somewhere around 200,000 units a year. Recently, over the last decade, we've been producing about 80 or 90,000 units a year for a state that's much more populous than it was a generation or two ago. And there have been consequences to that. There are consequences to that accumulate over time. And our statewide, every year, regular basis, the state calculates what we know we would need in order to project and meet our regional demands. And in the most recent housing cycle, we've built only about 46% of what we knew we needed statewide. And on our current status quo path, we see no change to that. I think the other reality is just that we've also seen stagnation in terms of income growth, particularly for the bottom half of the income distribution. So the purchasing power, the income literally that folks are getting, particularly in that middle income area, has really hollowed out. You have folks at the high end who retain the purchasing power, who are able to afford these kinds of incredible prices. Obviously, you have folks at the very bottom who really have no choice but to move in with the parents, and then you see a kind of a real challenge and exodus, frankly, of folks in the middle right now from places like the Bay Area.
So, you noted, the state has been building less than it used to. It is also building less than other states relative to the increase in population. McKinsey just reported from 2009 to 2014, California added 544,000 households, but only 467,000 net housing units. States such as New York have added nearly 80% more housing units than California relative to population growth. As a result, California's real estate prices have increased by more than 15% since 2009, while median income grew only 5% to your...
I think that report nailed it. We are, what they pointed out is we are 49th in the nation in terms of housing units per capita here in California, second only to Utah in the bottom of this distribution. And even if you look over the last couple of years, if you look at peer states like New York, I think they've been very good at saying, we just aren't producing at the same rate that peer states are. We at metro areas too, if you look at even places like Seattle versus San Francisco, you see Seattle in many ways very comparable metropolitan area producing about almost twice as many units as you see in the San Francisco area.
And they don't feel like they're in a housing glut up there, certainly. You said 46%, that we're building only 46% of what we estimate we need. Why is the number so low?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors there that
rank
get
a few
at
of
them. Clearly there's just something that's gone a little bit out of whack, I think, in terms of the ability to get land built and get it approved. I think, Kate talked about the fact that we've seen over the last few decades in California very significant downzonings. So there's simply less available entitled land that gives you the ability to build at density. So when you do want to build, you often have to go to a council or a planning commission and sort of negotiate for a change to the code. The entitlement process itself has also just gotten very extended here in California. There was a good report by UC Berkeley's Turner Center earlier this year that showed that coastal California communities have a 30% longer entitlement process than the rest of the country as a whole. So it's just simply taking longer to get there.
Can I add to Ben's? I think we're lagging because not every city is doing its fair share. It's a regional problem. Some cities are being proactive, like Mountain View, you heard earlier, but not every other city is. So we really need to work on the very restrictive zoning and land use regulations that are putting up barriers to equality.
Well, and that's the perfect segue into the next subject area, because one characteristic of many metro areas, but certainly Northern California, is a lot of fractured responsibility. There are so many communities in this region with authority splintered in so many directions. Kate, is it possible to develop a comprehensive solution under the legal structures that now exist and governmental structures?
Well, I'm a pessimist at heart, so frankly, I think no. I think that it's certainly possible to make changes on a city-by-city level, and we see cities that have done that and have done a very good job, right? You've seen Mountain View kind of really, get their arms around the problem, understand the problem, take significant actions to fix it. Likewise, you've seen Redwood City take significant steps to add housing, right? You see cities where, you see the membership of their council change, to people who are more compassionate towards the problem of housing, more willing to do what it takes to fix the problem. But then you've got cities like Brisbane who, they want to add upwards of 20,000 jobs and zero housing, and when asked about it, they say, well, our residents come first, and well, San Francisco will build the housing, right? And so there's no mechanism to punish them for doing that. There's no incentive to get them to build the housing.
Realistically, if it's city by city, community by community, Ben, is it ever going to work?
It's a tough one. I think conceptually, the framework that we have today, for better or worse, the state, is one that looks at this from a regional and metropolitan level, right? And in
the Association of Bay Area Governments, right?
Exactly. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission and ABAG for the Bay Area. And in fact, if you look as recently as SB 375, groundbreaking piece of climate change legislation that came out of the state a few years back, you'll see yet again an affirmation from Sacramento saying to the regions,
Right.
You have an obligation to
Yes.
think about housing. And when you're doing your regional transportation plans, you need to be lining those up with your regional housing plans. You need to be planning for the growth you know you're going to need. And I think we have a system today that on paper would seem to work reasonably well in the sense that the regions go through a process
Right.
of allocating out units. And in fact, the Bay Area, I think, does a good job too of trying to think about concentrating growth in areas that align with the sort of climate change goals of the state. We're trying to actually invest in the transit-rich corridors, create more density in the transit-rich areas. I think the disconnect is that great plans on paper still don't manifest themselves.
Why not? I mean, that's the question, right? So the evidence is overwhelming that the ABAG, I guess, is a new acronym for me, but it sets the goals.
Yeah.
Cities accept the goals and then don't meet the goals on a consistent basis. Where is the process? And in fact, to the extent they do meet the goals, often I've seen reporting from in the Mountain View Voice that the homes that are built under this are often much more tilted toward the high end than they are supposed to be under the process. In Santa Clara County, more than 80% of the housing approved for construction were high-end homes for those earning more than $120,000 or more annually. Meanwhile, cities almost universally fail to meet their allocations for below-market rate housing for low and moderate income residents. Numbers for some cities were wildly off the mark. Why does the process break down? Is it because there is no enforcement mechanism?
I think there is no enforcement mechanism, and I think that the penalties are not severe enough. You can pick out sites, but if you don't actually build them, nothing really happens. And in communities where they don't want anything to happen, they're like, take away our powers. Take away our local powers to not give out permits. It doesn't matter, then we don't have to build. So it'll slow down the growth.
Yeah, we definitely have a process that's very focused for all kinds of good reasons on soliciting community input and making sure that we have community voices, community concerns factored in. But I think what we often see is that there are a lot of ways to get to know on valid projects out of very reasonable concerns that come out both of communities that are facing gentrification, that are seeing incredible change that feels to be impacting lower-income communities or communities of color, as well as sort of, on the other end, sort of more classic NIMBY situations where you have
Right.
wealthy homeowners trying to keep the poor people out. I mean, you kind of have both. And the systems we've built, I think, work very well to slow the growth down. I want to put one more issue out on
Sure.
the table, which I think we can't overlook, which is just the cost of construction of housing today. Part of the reason we're only building for the highest end for the market rate is because the cost of construction means that you can only get a return that justifies that investment when you're serving that higher end market rate luxury product. And there, I think, when you peel back the onion, a lot of the issues have to do with again, very valid issues around health and safety and making sure everything's up to code and earthquake safety and so on and so forth. But also, I mean, root cause here, I think we have to remember that local jurisdictions are very constrained from a tax-based perspective.
Right.
And so they often put on these new developments sort of the obligation of carrying forward through fees and other impact fees and costs, many of the basic general functioning.
We heard from the mayors, Candice, in the mayor's panel, they were saying, we simply don't have the revenue on a consistent basis to support affordable housing in the way that, for example, they said when we have delegations coming from Europe, we just don't have the tax base to do it.
Well, you'll forgive me, but I mean, I think that's a red herring entirely. I mean, every developer I've ever talked to, I've been to lots of conferences like this, seen lots of audiences filled with developers. Every single one of them I've seen, they're like, you know what, if we can build big enough, we can make 25% of those units affordable. We can subsidize them. And obviously the ratio is very depending on, how large the project really is, what they're trying to do, the materials involved, but all of them are happy to build and have inclusionary housing, which doesn't cost the taxpayer a cent. And so at that point, when the mayors say, oh, well, we just don't have the money, well, it's like, no, this doesn't actually take money. It's just you have to approve a project that's going to be more than 2 stories.
I think we need to parse that a little bit because I do think there is sort of 2 issues there. One is, okay, so let's say it is possible to build luxury high-end market rate product. What's not getting built, again, is the sort of middle income, more sort of entry-level housing that this state used to do very well, in fact, back in the 70s and 80s. And that is clearly a failure of the marketplace for all the reasons that Kate is talking about. I do think there is another segment, which is sort of really the folks making minimum wage, the frontline service workers, the most vulnerable members of our community, elderly folks in Social Security, folks who are trying to get off the streets. Even there, they're not going to quite get in there. And I think when the mayors are saying they don't have money, they're right. They don't have money and they need money in order to be able to serve that population. I think that's a place where
The
we do need to
county
find
did
new
approve an affordable housing bond in November, $950 million. Is that a turn in the wind?
So even with $1 billion, unless we have the zoning changes needed, it's not going to be a financially feasible or financially reasonable project. So we still need the community will to change the zoning.
And the most important zoning changes would be what to create?
Increasing the density to allow for more units to make it financially feasible.
So the governor had an answer for all of this that he proposed, which was to allow developers to bypass the local permitting building restrictions for housing projects with at least 5% of the units affordable to low-income residents. The bill kind of never got off the runway in the state legislature this year. Is that dead? Is it behind us? Is there another life? Is there another variation? Is he still committed to finding a state role in solving this?
Yeah. So actually, the bill was even more modest than you characterized
Okay.
it. It actually only focused on parcels that would be useful for conforming zoning. So the idea was if you met the mark on the zoning, then you would have a sort of an entitlement to build at that level. And, it wouldn't apply to projects seeking variances or adjustments. And it didn't go forward. It hit, for a variety of reasons, a lot of political opposition. And we weren't able to get it over the finish line last year. I think the governor has, in this past year in particular, as the housing crisis has really become much more elevated and central to the dialogue up in Sacramento, been consistent in saying, look, we have a housing crisis, number one. Number two, the solutions can't just be fiscal. To Kate's point, throwing money at the problem is not going to solve it. In fact, it would be sort of inefficient in many ways to solve money at such a costly solution if we don't pair it with fiscal relief. So I think right now we're right at the beginning of the next legislative session. We've seen a couple of legislators already move forward sort of new versions of something that might look very much like the by right. We had something by Assemblymember Bloom out of Santa Monica, something by Scott Wiener here in San Francisco. Both of them in their chambers are moving forward bills to restart that dialogue. The leadership Assembly Democrats, I expect to put forward a proposal as well on housing shortly, and the governor will put forward his vision through the budget process in the middle of January. So I think
he will have a proposal. He will have either this or something new when you say he puts forward his vision in the budget process?
I mean, that is the space where traditionally the governor would take this on. I think looking back to what he did in the budget process in the past year, he's clearly already set a signal that this is something that he's going to be focusing on. What's in the final document, I think we need to wait and see until we get there in January.
Kate, Candice, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the degree to which the state, more intervention by the state as opposed to trying to change policy community by community, would be part of the solution, or do you think that's is that a promising road to go down?
I think it has to be part of the solution. I mean, with 101 cities that make up the Bay Area, I mean, there's just no way that you're going to have enough effort, enough people on the ground to win kind of pro-housing elections year after year after year, especially when you see that the people who care most about it, every year are getting priced out and every year are moving further away. So every year there's fewer people to carry that torch.
And you are one of them who are moving further away, correct?
Yeah, and so every year there's fewer people to kind of sound that horn and make it clear that that's a priority. And so when you see communities that are getting richer and richer, that's a community that cares less and less about housing.
Mm-hmm. And I agree. I think cities can continue to work and collaborate together, but in the meantime, the state should step in. I actually personally supported the by right proposal for different reasons, including forcing some cities to start acting and taking its fair share.
We've been focusing on local government, and we're talking about state government and local government. We are within yards of some of the most profitable and powerful companies in the world, globe straddling brands. What is their role and responsibility in the housing challenge in this community? Kate?
Well, I would love for their role to be a better representative for their own employees and to also encourage their own employees to participate in the political process. There's a lot of companies out there that won't even register their own employees to vote. They don't give them the day off to go vote. They don't in any way facilitate any kind of political engagement, right? Even just sort of like a panel that would explain to people what's going on at the local level, who's standing for what, what's going on, what are the issues. There's a lot of companies who they don't do their part to educate their employees, and they don't do their part to help their employees go vote and take part in the political process. And they don't show up to city council. The only time they show up to city council is when they're asking for a permit to build office, but they're not there when we're talking about how much housing we're going to build for the city as a whole. And so I don't necessarily think that it's the responsibility or the role of companies to build their own housing. I think we kind of live in a society where we'd like that to be more independent. We don't necessarily want company towns. But that's kind of where they're left with, because I think they've spent a lot of time not being engaged in the process, and so the only thing they have left is, well, okay, we have a piece of land, let's try to build housing on it. But that's, I mean, it's a Band-Aid solution, right? I mean, okay, so you've built the housing for your employees, what happens when your employees move, right?
Candice?
So I think their role is evolving. I mean, they came here to be a tech company, but now they're starting to realize that they need to be more engaged with the immediate communities. So it's evolving. They're starting to understand their role in the housing crisis. And some companies, like you hear the Facebook, talking about contributing to affordable housing or even building some of the housing for themselves, and building it for the community. So I think that's evolving, and it's a positive thing.
Ben, what's the economic dimension of this? Because we did an event recently in Phoenix, Margaret was there, and the mayor of Phoenix, I mean, basically their tech industry is built on the inability of people to afford to live in the Bay Area. And that is the principal, they feel that is this principal fuel of their growth. It's just people, feeling the need, and I'm sure if we were in Portland, they would say something of the same. Is there an economic growth? Is the housing crisis just merely, is it mostly an inequality challenge, or is it also just a growth challenge?
There is no doubt that this state will see constrained GDP and reduced job growth as a consequence of the housing crisis. That is without dispute what our future holds. I think about this for a second. Of the top 10 metros in the United States seeing the greatest outmigration of millennials, the 6 of those are the top 6 metros in the state.
Really?
Right. So our most educated, youngest folks are going to Phoenix, they're going to Nashville, they're going to Charlotte. So I think we have to be thoughtful about that. And I think if you're working for we're trying to run a business here in Silicon Valley, I mean, it's obvious. You're paying more for talent because that talent is having to make incredible choices about where they live and how far out they commute. And you're paying for that, and you're not getting access to the kind of labor pool you really ought to.
Let's get a couple questions in, and I have one final one for you guys. Questions in the audience? I see one over here, and one over there too, yeah. Good. And then we'll do them both, yeah.
Hi, I'm Jeff Greger. I'm from San Jose State University, and I'm really interested in the idea of housing segregation. So you guys had kind of brought that idea up of the people that are left are the ones that already have theirs. So that part was really interesting, and I'm really interested in what that could lead to in terms of local politics and really thinking about maybe even legal challenges. Some of these ideas, this coded language around character in neighborhoods. I'm living in Palo Alto, and I think about this whole idea of, well, we don't want, as you had mentioned, we don't want certain types of development in certain areas, and nobody really wants affordable housing next to them. Is there another solution? There's something like vouchers that kind of puts people looking for affordable housing into the mainstream. Just kind of curious what our options are there.
The impact on income and racial segregation in the communities of the housing, of the cost rise.
I think when we build affordable housing, we don't try to segregate it. We really just try to find where's the land available, where is it appropriate, is it near transportation? Because it's so hard to find the land, we don't try to segregate it. But that's a different question when you talk about the community willing to support the project. So, yeah, do you want to add to it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my only other my observation here would be, and the State Legislative Analyst's Office actually did a very good report on this earlier this year. We are seeing in this state, despite its great wealth, right? We're sixth largest economy in the world, an increasing sort of tale of two cities that's going on here in California. And what's interesting is that the data shows that for the last 20 years, essentially poorer communities have tended to get poorer, and wealthier communities have tended to get wealthier in California. That's actually not the historic pattern. The historic pattern for most of the 20th century was that communities tended to converge. So richer communities tended to see an influx of folks moving in to try and access those jobs. And so incomes tended to kind of converge back. But since about 1990, we've seen that pattern diverging. And in fact, one of the great tragedies in California is that the number of communities of concentrated poverty has actually steadily grown since the year 2000. We have more folks, more kids who are poor, growing up in poor neighborhoods. And we know from great work done by Raj Chetty at Stanford and others that severely constrains their outcome in terms of their likelihood of getting into the middle class. So I think you can draw a picture right back down to some of the land use decisions that are happening here at the local level to say that this is part of the reason why folks, communities of color, low-income folks, grown-up poor, are more likely to stay that way. And I think that's a real problem for us here in California.
Worth noting that is occurring amid what is possibly the single greatest concentration of market wealth in one place in the history of humanity.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm Emily Leathers. About 2 months ago, I became a new homeowner in Scott Wiener's district because we realized we weren't going to be able to stay here and raise a family if rent kept increasing. I promised myself that I wouldn't, that I would keep myself away from NIMBY attitudes, and I'd push for that in my neighbors as well. And I'm just curious, what policies should I be putting my money, my lobbying, my vote behind?
That's great. And in fact, my final question was, what are the most practical things that can be done at every level of government now in the near term? So I will just piggyback on your question as a kind of a final thought.
I think to repeat at the local level, really encourage your local politicians to change the zoning and the land use regulations and really go out into the community. I think part of it is the community will. So let's really engage the community to have a change in mindset to allow for more housing and more density, even in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think if there's specific policies that you're looking to support, I think number one is supporting what is known as the missing middle housing. So it's co-op housing, it's SROs, but it's also just kind of like houses that look like normal houses from the outside, but are actually duplexes or triplexes or quadplexes. It's actually amazing how much density you can get with houses that still look pretty much like normal houses, and we just don't do enough of that. It just seems like a notion that's kind of anachronistic to us at this point, but is actually very popular in Europe and makes for great communities.
Ben, final thought.
Yeah, two things. One, a lot of this is how, I think, is an education opportunity. We find surveys again and again show that when you ask the man or woman on the street what they think about a new building getting built in their neighborhood, whether they're a homeowner or even a renter, they're going to say, no, we don't want that. That's just going to make my rent higher or make my costs increase. And yet if you flip it around and you say to them, well, should we be building more dense housing in our community in order to give folks who needed a hand up or an opportunity, in order to let our kids grow in this community or let our service workers grow, then all of a sudden it flips right around and people overwhelmingly say, yes, we need to build here in our community because we owe those folks a chance. So I think we need to be very thoughtful about how we tell that story and frame the message. The second, I think Kate nailed it on this sort of organic growth. I think there's a huge opportunity to just do more with the communities that we have. One of the great legislative triumphs in the last session in Sacramento was a suite of bills that actually make it vastly easier to build accessory dwelling units in communities all up and down the state. You can now go in and add a second unit ministerially. You don't need to go and get your neighbors to approve it or go to a zoning council. It waives, in many cases, parking requirements or extra fees. So I think looking at the land we have and trying to figure out how we can creatively kind of get more out of it, I think is really important, particularly as we find a lot of boomers now aging up and having very large houses in a very small footprint.
Well, after a sustained discussion of the challenges and the problems, I think you've given us some terrific thoughts on what might be some of the solutions. So will you join me in thanking Kate, Candice, and Ben?